Friends, welcome to the conference. My name's John Weiss. For those of you who don't know me, I'm still the current dean of the school where this event is based, and it's my responsibility to welcome you all to the university. Some people are based here already, and to all those who've come from outside, you're extremely welcome. The Vice-Chancellor will be hosting a conference dinner this evening, so you'll receive probably a rather more formal welcome from him. It's worth stressing at the outset that Bradford University's had long links with Tanzania over the years, not just because Tanzania is an important country in a region where the university is a special interest, but as will become apparent during the course of the next couple of days, a number of members of staff, both present and past, have worked in Tanzania, have had very close contacts with Tanzania, and currently we have a formal collaborative program with Mzumbe University in Tanzania. So to some extent that's the fruition of those links that have been built up over the years. Well, all our visitors from outside are extremely welcome. I'd like to highlight particularly a welcome to some special friends of ours. First of all, the team from Mzumbe University, led by the Provost Chancellor, Professor Kuzila. Getting African names twisted here. As I say, this is a very important link for us, and we're delighted that they could make the long journey to the north of England to attend this event. Also pleased to welcome our ex-colleague Andrew Coulson here on the platform, who has been a long-standing observer of the Tanzanian scene. Was a colleague with us for 4 or 5 years, and we're delighted to welcome him back. And I'd also like to mention at the end of the table Brian Van Arkadie, who's been known to many of us on and off for a very long period of time. I should say he was the first supervisor for my PhD a very long time ago, and he taught me all about the glamour of development economics, and so we're delighted to welcome Brian as well. Well, as I'm sure you all know, thinking about Africa tends to go in cycles, and I guess thinking about Tanzania goes in cycles as well. And it wasn't so long ago that some people were referring to Tanzania and a number of other African economies as basket cases, and nowadays they're referring to Tanzania and a number of African economies as emerging economies, potential sources of growth in the world economy, and so on. And no doubt both of these characterizations are grossly oversimplified, and one of the things we'll be teasing out over the next couple of days is where the balance of judgment should lie. Now, I'm really not proposing to make any contribution to that sort of debate. I don't perceive myself as an expert on Tanzania, but maybe just a few personal comments on this. I first went to Tanzania in 1979, which was the first visit on what was the initial collaboration between Bradford University and Mzumbe. It wasn't a university in those days. Very interesting visit. For the first time somebody's been in Africa. One of my recollections is that Morogoro seemed a very long way away from Dar es Salaam, partly to do with the quality of the road infrastructure. I remember some scarcities. There only used to be a beer delivery on a Friday to Morogoro, and that used to run out quite rapidly by Saturday, and I'm sure this wasn't a scarcity of beer. It was a sort of transport problem to get things up and down. I went back again to Tanzania in 1986, and I spent a couple of weeks in one of the beach hotels outside Dar es Salaam. Not as a holidaymaker, I should add, but we were delivering a training program there. Again, there were power cuts, there were shortages. This was the time of the import controls biting quite hard at that point. So imported goods were both scarce and expensive. I went back again in 1993 and noticed change. This time, well, I mean, I was staying in the Kilimanjaro Hotel in Dar es Salaam. I was part of a EU group visiting Tanzania. The liberalisation had started by then. Imported goods were available, but as in much of Africa, the cry was that now there are things in the shops, but it's very difficult to afford them. So there was an issue of purchasing power there, and power cuts were still a problem. Now, I haven't been back to Tanzania since the early 1990s, so I can't really say anything very much about the turnaround, and like others, I've read positive things coming out of Tanzania. But one sort of anecdote I will mention is that I did play a small role, and I stress a very small role, in the World Bank study, Light Manufacturing in Africa, which was a very big study looking at the constraints on the manufacturing sector in Africa. And as part of this exercise, surveys were done of firms in 3 African countries: Tanzania, Zambia, and Ethiopia. And the idea was to compare the competitiveness of these firms with producers in China and Vietnam. And as we know, that's one of the big challenges for African manufacturing, competing with imports from the Far East. And the results of the survey were largely unsurprising. African wages are lower than in the Far East, but they're not that low given the income level of African countries. Productivity, of course, is considerably lower in African firms, and in general, logistics costs, infrastructure costs, and so on are higher. But the key point to bring out was, of the 3 African countries in the survey, Tanzanian firms tended to come out strongest from the comparison. And my role was simply to crunch the numbers and come up with some indications of the economic efficiency of production in these 3 locations. And actually, Tanzania was cost competitive in some fairly simple labor-intensive things like polo shirts and leather shoes, and in some agro-processing activities like wheat milling. So this isn't a major industrial transformation, but it is a positive sign that I would suggest, and there are things that can be built on. Now, this story is to some extent written up in a paper that I've produced for the conference, and which will be presented tomorrow. And if anybody is interested in following that up, then look at the paper, and I'll be happy to answer questions as necessary. So I think that's enough from me. I'm just the warm-up act, and we've got the big players coming on the scene now. And I wish everybody well. I hope this is a fruitful couple of days.
For those who don't know me, my name's David Potts. I'm kind of coordinating the conference. Variously, I've described myself as a coordinator and a convener or whatever. Anyway, that's my job. And so in that job, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping. I've got a list of things that I have to say. And the first one is, as you can imagine in all of these things, is about fire. We don't intend to have any fires in here. But if you do hear a fire alarm, leave the building by the nearest fire exit. The assembly point is the main visitor car park between the Norcroft building, which is this one, and the Richmond building, which is the main university building. Don't use the lift, but there is a platform lift from the auditorium for disabled access to the fire exits if needed. Okay, that's the first bit. Next bit, very important bit, toilets are just outside the auditorium. So go through that door and out there you'll find the toilets. Health warning, no smoking anywhere in the building. Bradford University, I think in common with pretty well every other university in the UK, is a no smoking university, so we don't have any smoking in the building. The nearest smoking point, if you're desperate, is the shelter at the entrance to the Green Student accommodation area, which is kind of over that way. Turn right out of Norcroft, then right again down the road if you need to smoke. If not, don't worry. Please put mobiles on silent, but feel free to tweet. That's what my instructions say. Okay, that's the main bit of the instructions, but then just one other thing. We will, as you can see, we are being photographed. If you don't want to be photographed, please tell us. Okay, if you have any objections to being photographed, tell us and we will try to make sure that we don't photograph you. Okay? The other thing that you should know is that, as John explained, part of the reason for having this conference is to do with our relationship with Mzumbe University. And obviously we are very pleased to welcome 3 members of staff, with the Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and also one of the lecturers from Mzumbe University. But we also have a lot of students in Mzumbe University, because our collaborative program with Mzumbe University involves students in Tanzania doing University of Bradford master's degrees. And these degrees are conducted by our colleagues in Mzumbe University. Now, one of the things we want to do is to make the proceedings in terms of this conference available to our students in Tanzania. So we are having the conference videoed. So if you have any problem of being on screen, of being videoed, please tell us and we'll stop. Okay? Otherwise, we will assume that you don't mind being filmed and you don't mind then being seen performing in Tanzania. Okay, that's that one. Lunch. Lunch will be in the reception area here, a sort of snack lunch. So everybody feel free, help yourself to whatever there is on offer. We're going to have a drinks reception from 5:30 to 6:30, again in the same place. And then afterwards we are going to Anam's restaurant, which is just up the road from here. And if you are a speaker, you don't have to pay. We will give you a ticket. So if you're a speaker and you haven't already got a ticket, I have a ticket for you. If you're not a speaker, then you have to pay. This is the incentive that our speakers get. Okay, so you should find also in your packs, you should find a map and a guide so that you can find your way around. Okay. Finally, what I should mention is that the funding of the conference was partly met by the John and Elnora Ferguson Centre for African Studies, called JEFCAS. I ought to mention that because we ought to thank, from my point of view, the people who provided some of the money for what we're going to do. I should thank everybody for coming here, and I'm more or less on time. In fact, 3 minutes early to start the presentations. What I'm proposing to do is to get the three presenters to present their presentations first, and then we can have a panel discussion afterwards. And we have until 1 o'clock, so we have 2 hours. And what I would say is if our speakers can try to keep themselves to say about 25 minutes, and I will pass a note over to you if I think you're beginning to run out of time. That's about it, I think, from all the notes that I've got on my pieces of paper. I don't think there's anything else. So before we start the presentations, does anybody have any questions that you want to ask about anything that's going on? Otherwise, I will pass you over to our former colleague, Andrew Coulson.
Good morning, everybody, and Abari Asabui. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And so I'd like to start by thanking all the people in Bradford who've made it possible, but especially David, who's been indefatigable in creating the possibility of this conference. But also to say how much a pleasure it is for me to come back, because I left Tanzania in 1976, and I came and worked in what was then the Project Planning Centre for Developing Countries at this university for the next 6 years. And it enabled me to not only get a wider perspective on development issues, but to make the transition back to life in England. So we have very fond memories of our time in Bradford. One of the things I did here was to reflect on what had happened in Tanzania in the form of a book, Tanzania, A Political Economy. And some of you will have seen the things I put the flyers for the second edition on the table. It's not often that a book has a second edition. Certainly a book on a country like Tanzania not often has a second edition 30 odd years, just over 30 years after the first edition. It was a big challenge to write a new introductory chapter that would try and bring some of the themes of the original book up to date. But the book is very much about political economy, and that's my topic here, and so we'll refer to it from time to time. Finally, I need to say a little bit that I'm also here representing the Britain-Tanzania Society, and we were invited to sort of ally ourselves. I can't say that we're exactly a co-sponsor of the project, but we're certainly very, very happy to see it happening. The Britain-Tanzania Society is probably the biggest grouping of its kind that links an African country to people in this country. And it has an email list and mailing list of over 800 addresses. And it is a way in which many people who've worked in Tanzania keep in touch with things that are happening in Tanzania. My job as a board member is actually to arrange seminars for the Britain-Tanzania Society. And just to give you a feel of it, the next one in London in a few days' time is about the 2012 population census in Tanzania and the real issues that raises about the very considerable growth in population, which if you go back to Tanzania after a delay like I did, is something you just can't avoid. The fact that the country is growing, that it's over 40 million people and well over now, and more than 3, some say more than 4 people living in Dar es Salaam. So very rapid changes in population. Now, what I want to do in the relatively short time I've got is to talk a little bit about political economy and a little bit about what's happened in Tanzania. And I've called it From the Arusha Declaration to Big Results Now. The reason for that, the Arusha Declaration occurred just before I first went to Tanzania. So that 1967 corresponds to when I really was a participant, if you like, in what was happening in Tanzania. Big Results Now is the most recent policy statements and policy proposals I'm aware of that may even have been superseded already, but I think not. And I think for people who haven't come across it, they will actually find it quite interesting to see what is happening and make some subtle, perhaps too subtle comparisons between Big Results Now and the second 5-year development plan that's occurred very much when I first went out to Tanzania. So, first of all, a few things about political economy. I mean, the phrase goes back to before there was a subject or discipline called economics. the classical economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo Malthus, they all wrote books in which had political economy in the title, and what they meant by that was that you actually had to look at the distribution of income between classes. So they talked about peasants, they talked about rentiers, or we'd probably call them bankers these days, talked about manufacturers and workers. So political economy was about how wealth was divided between classes. Karl Marx, a little bit later than those pioneers of classical economics, in his early writing, turned it into a determinist theory of economic development. It's interesting that determinist theories were picked up again after the Second World War, so it wasn't just Marx that had determinist theories, but the idea that you actually went from a primitive existence of some sort to feudalism, to capitalism, and ultimately a revolution, the working class would take over and you get some sort of socialism. What is less well known is that in his later years, Marx actually was much more flexible than that. He made a real effort to learn Russian. He actually made an effort to learn Turkish in order to understand what was happening in the more developing, we'd probably call them middle-income countries of the world of his time. And in doing so, he realized it wasn't automatic that they go through these stages. All sorts of other things were possible, and that there might be long periods of stability in which surpluses could be made in, let's say, in irrigated communities in the Middle East, and they would survive for a long time. The communist world basically bypassed all that. They were stuck with the determinist and very rigid theories which were debated in the 1890s and fixed thereafter. And picked up by Lenin in his early writing on the development of capitalism in Russia, which very much staged things. And then on his later writing, 1917, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which actually takes a view that in many ways we would find very congenial now, that big companies are big animals in the jungle when it comes to these sorts of things, and that the relationships they have, the power they have, is something that you can call imperialism. In the 1950s and 60s and on into the 70s, this was taken up first in Latin America and then in Africa, in what we now call dependency theory. It wasn't called that immediately, but the idea that countries like Tanzania are created by colonial powers to produce raw materials, agricultural or mineral, and that this then goes on after independence through forms of political control based largely on large multinational companies. So that line was the dominant ideology when I went out first to Tanzania in 1967. It's interesting that there have been a lot of debates about these determinist theories, and Marxists actually realized that it wasn't quite so simple. When you tried to spell out what was meant by the different forms of modes of production, you got into all sorts of difficulties. And one of the dangers was that you wrote out history. You didn't allow any agency. You said everybody acts in their class interests. Well, actually, they often don't act in their class interests. Nyerere Nujama is probably a very good example of somebody not acting in the interests of the class that he represented. I mean, he was actually trying something else. And so you actually need history, you need the detail, you need to get involved in what actually happened. And that actually was the strength of my book that came out in 1982, and it was picked up by other Marxists for precisely that reason, that it took history seriously, it took the detail, it took the discretion, the fact that Tanzanians could choose to do one thing, right? Not that much discretion necessarily, but there were choices there. We move forward a bit more quickly. We've got Michael Lofchie here from the Los Angeles School, very much influenced by Robert Bates, who one of the first institutional economists to apply his work to the development field, who basically said that a lot of government intervention, especially marketing boards, are all about exploiting, taking money from rural areas and using it in urban areas. And that thinking has moved on into discussions of well, a reinvention, a reuse of the term political economy, not this time by Marxists, but by economists from the World Bank, by institutional economists, people from Chicago School as well. Michael Lofchie's recent book on Tanzania uses the phrase political economy in the title and illustrates it very well. Again, examining the interests of the Tanzanian elite. And one of the most interesting things in his book, and I'm sure he'll talk about this, is he actually demonstrates that an overvalued exchange rate, right, and that's what there was before structural adjustment in Tanzania, is actually very congenial to people who can get hold of foreign exchange, because they can multiply that foreign exchange by illegal or semi-legal trading. And that is why they didn't actually oppose, a lot of Tanzanians didn't actually oppose structural adjustment. It was only later on, after they'd got established, that they actually realized that free markets might be even better. It might actually suit them even more. And they then agreed that something had to be done and agreed with the devaluations and accepted the devaluations and the structural adjustment that took place. So that's a very interesting take, very original. I think it's more to be said about it, but it's a very original approach to this use of political economy. Moving to the debates in Tanzania, right, I mean the strategies up to 1967 were much like most other ex-colonies in Africa. In terms of, I mean, they were about rural development. You could call it primitive accumulation if you like, generating surpluses from rural production to use in other things, infrastructure and manufacturing investment. So the improvement approach, which meant working with small farms, the transformation approach, which meant different forms of large-scale agriculture, import substitution industries. And I've already implicitly criticised much of that in what I've said, but the criticism is very, very well known that especially the import substitution industries were extremely inefficient. And then in 1967, perhaps I should say, there's somebody else in the room who was very much involved in the transformation approach, and that's Anthony Ellman, who was the manager of Upper Kitete settlement scheme, which was one of the attempts to make the transformation approach work in the 1960s. So large-scale agriculture, but with settlers, a smallish group of settlers brought onto the land and given help by a very capable manager, dare I say it, to actually get the economies of scale that were thought to be possible in large-scale agriculture. But the settlement schemes as a whole failed. I mean, they were not successful. And that was one of the things that led up to the Arusha Declaration and especially Ujima Vijijini in 1967. So you have this statement of socialist policy by Nyerere and TANU political party, followed almost immediately by nationalisation of the banks, nationalisation of the major industries, and much, much else. There were two other policy statements in 1967, one on education, really arguing that you had to make education relevant to development, and the one I've already mentioned on rural development, which was about Ujima villages, which was supposed to be voluntary, but in practice after 1969, the president and the country despaired of the slow speed of voluntary Ujima villages and imposed living in villages by force. The 1969 to 74 second five-year development plan made some concessions. I mean, again, Brian can talk much more about this, Brian van Arkadie, who was the coordinator of writing of the plan. But one of the things that I remember right at the very end of the drafting, we went through the document and we added the word Ujima almost every time the word village was in the early draft. So every time something was supposed to happen in a village now happened in an Ujima village. It didn't actually change anything or mean very much. And that type of thing was happening. If we move on to say a bit more about the second five-year plan, in my view, it is the absolutely key document of the period in terms of economic strategy. And that's because it had an intense research effort that led into it. There were working parties on every minor almost, every detailed aspect of the economy and of what was happening in Tanzania. It was very ambitious. Overall target of 6.5% growth rate. Target for marketed agriculture, 7.3%. Very, very optimistic targets. Right, I will move on. Volume 2 of the second five-year plan was largely a list of projects. They didn't list all 380 of the industrial projects, and Brian, I'm quite sure, would disown quite a lot of them from the start, and it's perhaps a good thing they weren't implemented. I mean, many of them would have really been almost certainly disastrous if they had been. But what was striking, and looking back on it is striking, is how little evidence there was of coordination between the projects. Import substitution, when done like that, giving anybody who wants to build a factory protection, led to some really very strange results. In 1970, Issa Shivji, who was then an undergraduate, produced his paper, Tanzania, the Silent Class Struggle. It came out as a special issue of the student journal Cheche, or the Spark. There's a fascinating book on the story of Cheche, which the book is longer than the total production of Cheche. We only produced 5 issues in the course of 1 year, 1970. But one of these issues was entirely devoted to Issa Shivji's paper. And he created the term, I don't know whether he got it from anybody else, I'm not aware of it. He started talking about a bureaucratic bourgeoisie. That's what the silent class struggle is about. It's a mouthful and it's parodiable. It's not language I find easy to use, but it is actually very, very accurate. Because what was happening was that you had a group of the bureaucracy, the people who had education, who had technical skills, put into administrative positions and given political and economic power. So they were a bourgeoisie in the sense that they had some power at least in the context of the international system. In other words, it recognized that there was a place for local initiative. It wasn't just that Tanzania was completely a victim of what was happening in the wider world, in the imperialist world outside. The university in the early 70s, in this period, was actually a hotbed of intellectual activity. And just say a little bit about the basic industry strategy. I mean, Clive Thomas was the professor of economics in the economics department for much of the time that I was on the staff there. And his understanding of the basic industry strategy was the deliberate creation of intermediate goods production. Right, and the list of things: steel, basic chemicals, cement, plastics, textiles, electricity generation, even possibly machine tools, although I'm not sure whether Thomas really thought that would happen quickly in Tanzania. And his argument was that a country that had all those intermediate goods industries could then make any consumer good. Right, those are the components of motor cars, or the components of washing machines, or the components of anything. If you've got all those intermediate goods, and that is an attempt to take a model of what happened in the Soviet Union and apply it to small countries from the Caribbean or from where Thomas came, or in Africa. I mean, whether it would actually happen or could have happened is another matter. The argument became irrelevant because the money just wasn't there to invest in those industries. But interestingly, at the same time as that argument was being put forward, another group of left-inclined political scientists and economists and sociologists were actually looking at countries like Korea and Taiwan and saying there is another model. Actually, you can actually have development that doesn't go through that basic industry approach. So people like Bill Warren, Aidan Foster Carter, who became a TV pundit almost on Korea, Jeffrey Kay, all this was happening in a very interdisciplinary approach to development studies that was at the university in that period. If you go back to the economy, the early 1970s, the writing was already on the many regards on the wall for Tanzania. When the oil price started to rise, it did not lead to corresponding rises in the prices on world markets of cotton or coffee. Right, so Tanzania was massively worse off. It was getting much less foreign exchange from its exports. That was one thing. Another was the forced villagization, which clearly impacted on agricultural production. And so towards the end of the 1970s, and especially after 1979, Tanzania became involved in fierce debates with the IMF because it basically refused to take on this model of structural adjustment. And as Lofchie shows in his book, and Jonathan Edwards in a parallel book almost called Toxic Age shows, it led to near chaos in the 1980s. It was not till Nyerere stood down in 1985 and then in 1986 that Tanzania came to terms with the IMF. And then went from almost one extreme to the other. It went from having refused to have any negotiation, to adopting everything the IMF said. And sometimes not, looking back on it, the debate is, could it have stood out and been a bit more selective and not given up quite so much so quickly. But the outcome was that it lost much of what had been achieved in the early period. I mean, near comprehensive universal primary education, widespread provision of health services in villages, and much else. And people couldn't, civil servants and teachers couldn't exist on their salaries at that time. So they were forced into parallel activities, as you might say, that could involve having a second job, could involve having a farm, or it could involve legal or illegal or very semi-legal things. And corruption was one of the ways in which you could actually survive in that period. If you then take it forward, and again moving on quite quickly, into the 1980s and 1990s, Tanzania basically became a capitalist state. Corruption became much more an issue and was widely discussed. The world price of gold rose and allowed the gold mining sector to quite unexpectedly revive and become a major source of foreign exchange. There was rapid urbanization and some revival in agriculture, especially food production. So you began to get a turnaround in the economy. And if you take these on into the present, all of those things are continuing, although the gold price is not quite as good as it was. But there's a whole lot of other mineral projects, coal, uranium, iron and steel. I could give a nickel. There's quite a lot of other ones. Tourism is a growth sector. The Chinese are involved. We got a paper on that in the conference. There is pressure for large-scale agriculture and irrigation, and impressive growth figures and mobile phones, computers, supermarkets, 4x4s, tarmac roads, all these things which are features of modern Tanzania. These sort of problems, turbulent politics, corruption, population growth, urbanization, declines in educational standards, rapid expansion of education, but problems with the standards, and less belief in self-reliant solutions. And if you look at the intellectual debate today, I'd say it's not at all as vibrant as it was. It's lost the interdisciplinary nature, too much economics, the quality of research, too much econometrics and regression, and an unwillingness to confront some of the intellectual issues. A gradual realization that markets will not solve all Tanzania's problems, and very interesting, an attempt to learn from the tiger economies of South Asia and East Asia. It's been interesting to see the speakers that have been invited to come and speak at conferences in Tanzania from Vietnam, from China, and recently from Malaysia. And so I want to just finish by talking briefly about big results now, which is a plan to turn Tanzania into a, well, it's part of the plan, which is already there, to turn Tanzania into a middle-income country in 25 years. Here is a slide that gives the summary of big results now. It involves something called a delivery lab methodology, in which a small number of stakeholders are basically put in a hotel or a university and expected to work out details of how planning how the sector should be developed. And they chose to have these in 6 areas: agriculture, education, energy, transportation, water, and resource mobilization. I think the most interesting thing about the list is what's not there. There's no sector of manufacturing and it's interesting speculation, why not? And just to give you a feel for it, the headline features in agriculture are 25 commercial farming deals, and my goodness, they are huge. And many of those 25 deals are over 20,000 hectare farms, which is just huge. I mean, it's hard to visualize a farm that big. 78 collective rice irrigation and marketing schemes. That is also a very big target. And then 275 collective warehouse-based marketing schemes, interestingly mostly in the Southern Highlands. I've less quarrel with those. But you can see the sort of way this type of planning can actually develop. The targets are very ambitious. It was supposed to involve expenditure of $10 billion over 3 years. So $4 billion, up to $3 to $4 billion a year. Actually, that amount of money was never identified. This sort of approach works better if you want to improve the port of Dar es Salaam or build a new port than it does in agriculture or in education. So you have to, it works in infrastructure better than it does in things that involve people. So what we can say in agriculture is that the 1960s debate has actually resumed, and the transformation approach has come to the fore again. So a lot of support for agribusiness, often either explicit or implicit underlying subsidies. Small-scale producers throughout growers, and we've got a presentation on that in the conference. The targets on irrigation are really very, very different from what is happening on the ground, and most people who know anything about Tanzania's water resources think that they're completely unrealistic. And yet there have been enormously successful innovations, especially in the Southern Highlands and especially by small farmers. So just reflecting and ending, the rapid GDP growth, in at least the reported statistics, is going to continue, but it won't lessen poverty in the rural areas unless something dramatically changes. And that is aside from issues about the quality of the data, on which, especially data of non-marketed production, which is very, very suspect. Corruption is a major issue, and corruption, we can talk about this in the discussion. Corruption in a situation like that Tanzania is in is both functional and dysfunctional. And sometimes it acts like a tax and gives somebody the chance to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, and they do it well. Other times it's just a drain. I would say the constraints in agriculture lie more in marketing than in production. It's no good expecting farmers to produce crops if they're not going to get paid. If they're going to get chitties which can never be redeemed, or promises and which are not carried out. If agriculture is seen as a form of welfare state, keeping peasants alive, then Tanzania risks going down a path not dissimilar to Nigeria, which some economists are actually anticipating. They're saying Tanzania will get an exaggeratedly high exchange rate and sort of further discourage what's happening in agriculture. So that is a rush through some very profound thinking about what is actually happening in Tanzania at the moment. And I think that we will have to see where all these things go. But my view is that if you can't get the small-scale sector to work, then the issues of poverty and inequality in Tanzania are going to get worse, not better.
Thank you, Andrew.
Begin, as Andrew did, by offering my deep thanks for the opportunity to come here today. This is thrilling. My appreciation to Dean Weiss, to David Potts, to Andrew Coulson, and the British Tanzania Society. If you don't already know, then what you will quickly discover about Tanzanian studies is that Tanzania studies punches well above its weight in terms of its intellectual importance and its ability to command the intellectual involvement of many, many people over a long period of time. One of the great fortunes of being involved in Tanzanian studies, I'm tempted to say, is that we stand on tall shoulders. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Andrew's book, The Political Economy of Tanzania, has dominated studies of Tanzanian political economy for 30 years. I had mentioned to Andrew earlier that the title of my own was chosen as an homage to Andrew's book on Tanzanian political economy. That was before I knew that his was being republished. Brian Van Arkadie has taught us about Tanzanian political economy for longer than I can easily remember. If I could just begin with one anecdote. Brian and I are about the same age, and we were both graduate students together at the University of California, Berkeley in the late 1950s and early 1960s. At that time, there were two places you could study development at the University of California, Berkeley. One was in the classroom, and there were major people on the faculty. But the word quickly spread among graduate students, especially interested in Africa, that there was this brilliant young student in economics, and his name was Brian Van Arkadie, and Brian had coffee every afternoon at 4 o'clock in the Bear's Lair, which was the major coffee shop on the campus, and those who were really interested in understanding development would go and join Brian's running seminar at the Bear's Lair coffee shop. Here I am again today. This is deja vu all over again, listening to Andrew Coulson and listening to Brian Van Arkadie and trying to squeeze in between two of the giants. I'll try to summarize some of the remarks in a conference paper that, as David said, I think he's going to post on the conference website. I come from an intellectual tradition that customarily divides major issues into 4 questions. So let me give you what I consider to be the 4 major questions of Tanzanian political economy. The first, again, homage to Bob Bates, why would reasonable political leaders have ever introduced a set of policies that had adverse effects on the economic performance of their country? The second, why would they have continued those policies in place for such a very long time after the adverse effects of those policies had become painfully visible to themselves, to Tanzanians, and to observers of Tanzanian society? Thirdly, why did they change those policies when they did in the mid-1980s? And finally, what have been the effects of the change in economic approach on the lives of ordinary Tanzanians? Andrew mentioned our indebtedness to the classical and a Marxian tradition of political economy. I think in looking at those questions, it would be remiss not to mention that for the last few months, we have been in the process of really not, I think, a paradigmatic change in the way we view the political economy of development, but a legitimization of a long-standing focus on poverty and inequality, and that's owing to the publication of the French economist Thomas Piketty's, now I think almost legendary volume, Capitalism in the 21st Century, Capitalism in the 21st Century. Which focuses our attention with much greater intensity, I think, on the effects of policy change as it goes on today. So question number 1, Why would Tanzanian political leaders, as reasonable individuals, have introduced a set of policies that had such adverse effects on the Tanzanian economy? The U-shaped arc of Tanzania's economic performance from decline to recovery is, I think, broadly familiar and well documented. The answer presented here is my view that Tanzania really had two very distinct economic philosophies going in the post-independence period. The first was the Ujamaa socialism of legendary President Julius Nyerere, with its emphasis on rural development, on the remediation of inequality, and on initiating a set of economic policies that would address the poverty of the very poorest Tanzanians. The second economic philosophy, I think, was development economics. This was a school of economic thought that flourished in the world in the 1950s and 1960s. Legendary figures, Albert Hirschman, W. Arthur Lewis, Hans Singer, Gunnar Myrdal. And my view is that this particular school of economic thought had great weight among individuals who were actually responsible for framing and implementing the economic policies that Tanzania pursued in the post-independence period. We've already had reference to the single-channel monopoly marketing board system, which in Tanzania, unlike many, many other African societies, was quickly extended after independence from the traditional export crop sector to the food production and distribution sector through something called the National Milling Corporation, a gigantic, overweening bureaucracy. Andrew's book, Political Economy of Tanzania, focuses our attention very centrally on the dissonance between Nyerere's philosophy of Ujamaa and the remediation of poverty and inequality, and the reality of what happened in Tanzania on the ground, which was the deterioration of the social projects to which Nyerere himself was most deeply committed: universal access to education, universal access to health care, and improving lives. My tendency is to explain that dissonance, the Coulson dissonance, on the basis of the theoretical proposition that what Tanzania was actually implementing in the post-independence period was not Ujamaa philosophy, but development economics. And the development economists taught us that the way for an economy to attain economic growth was to industrialize, and the way to industrialize was to transfer economic resources out of the agricultural sector, arguably the largest and most important single economic sector in the country, to transfer economic resources out of the agricultural sector and into the formation of large-scale industries. Industries would give you growth. So the dissonance is the dissonance between an overarching philosophy of poverty remediation on the one hand and an economic philosophy that said the way to do this is to industrialize and indeed to impose taxes on the agricultural sector, sometimes to a very large degree, potentially to a degree that negatively affected the agricultural sector. I mentioned the importance of development economics. Brian and I were talking last evening about the development economics idea. I cite an early Tanzanian economist. I may be the only person who recent years has reread with great attention the doctoral dissertation of Dr. Kigoma Malema, who completed his doctoral dissertation at Princeton University in 1971. It was a doctoral dissertation on the cotton sector. Dr. Malema was a student at Yale of Albert Hirschman and a doctoral student at Princeton University of W. Arthur Lewis, and his doctoral dissertation is about how cotton, as a particular crop within the export sector, can productively contribute resources to industrialization. So you had an economic philosophy that stressed this. For me, the first economic shock in Tanzania, and I'm glad we're going back a bit, 1967, we've mentioned the multi-year plans in Tanzania and Brian's contribution to those plans. In 1967, the government published a very modest document called the First Five-Year Plan, a midterm appraisal. The first economic shock was that the projections of foreign participation in Tanzanian industrialization had been somewhat overstated, maybe broadly overstated in the first plan. Foreign private investors had not made capital available in anything like the amount that the first five-year plan projected, and foreign public investors, that is to say the donor community, had not made funds available, and the implication of that was profound. The first five-year plan projected that industrialization would take place on the basis of a mix of domestic resources provided out of taxation and foreign capital, which itself would be a mix of foreign public participation and private capital investment. Without funds from those two sources, the burden fell on the Tanzanian government to capitalize industrialization. And if one wants to look for a single factor explanation of the ratcheting up of taxes on the agricultural sector, I think that first economic shock gives you as good a variable as you could possibly turn to in a brief period of time. Why did adverse economic policies continue as long as they did? Andrew mentioned the paradox of development. The paradox of development is it's not necessarily in the interest of a governing elite or a governing oligarchy to pursue economic reform. Indeed, to the extent that a governing oligarchy, governing elite, is profiting personally from an existing set of economic conditions, that governing elite has no particular economic interest of its own in pursuing economic reforms. I think corruption will be one of the topics on the table for our conference. I'll try to offer what I consider a kind of natural life cycle, natural economic history of corruption. I think it does begin in the low purchasing power of official salaries. But as the Piketty volume suggests, there's a limit to how much income we can actually consume. Before very long, we discover, if we're engaging in that practice, that the income from corruption is also available to us as capital to invest in various parts of the economy. So the fatal conjuncture, I think the fatal conjuncture in Tanzania was the combination of corruption on the one hand that originated in low purchasing power and the rise of the informal sector. I hope we can talk about that. The informal sector, which is the gray economy, the parallel economy, meant that that income that you obtained through rent seeking, if you want to put it that way, could be invested in the informal sector, often for great personal gains. Indeed, if you wanted to push this observation very hard, what you could say is that to the extent that conditions of scarcity in the official economy made for higher rates of profitability in the parallel economy, the governing elite had a direct stake in preserving conditions of economic scarcity in the official economy, because this meant that investments in the parallel sector had an even greater yield than would otherwise have been the case. This is Jonathan Barker's Development Paradox. Jonathan was a political scientist in the political science department at University of Dar es Salaam in the early 1970s, and his article on this topic mentions, or I think in some ways invents the term, the paradox of development, which is the idea that the elite has no obvious economic self-interest of its own in economic reform. That gets us to, now the beginning, I think, of the severe period of Tanzania's economic crisis, I would date it from the summer of 1974, which was the severe famine conditions. Those conditions of acute scarcity in Tanzania continued, by my calculation, for about 12 years, through the rest of the 1970s, through the Tanzania-Uganda War of 1978-1979, which was additionally calamitous as far as the economy, especially of the northern half of the country, was concerned. And those conditions of scarcity occurred through the beginning of economic reforms, conventionally dated from the moment when President Mwinyi succeeded to the presidency following President Nyerere in 1985. So that gives you a 12-year period, summer of 1984 to the summer of 1986, when the first, not the first IMF agreement was signed, but the first sustainable IMF agreement was signed between Tanzania and the IMF. So why that 12-year interval? Economic elite has no special interest in economic reform. Indeed, through rent seeking and the availability of capital to invest in the informal sector, it profiteers from conditions of economic scarcity. Why change? Back to the natural life cycle of corruption. I tend to see corruption in Tanzania, if I can use this term, almost in Hegelian terms. It's a dynamic process and it mutates, it morphs over time from one essential reality to another. Initially, corruption was Tanzania's form of primitive accumulation, Marxian term. It enabled investment in the informal sector, and Tanzanian business entrepreneurs, in a kind of hidden way, were able to participate in the informal sector in that particular respect. But there are limitations on the amount of profit that you can actually make by covert investments in a parallel economy. Tanzania still had a leadership code that, even though it was porous, was a kind of restraint on what members of the governing elite could do. It was still a socialist and state economy, especially since the basic industry era, which assigned industrial responsibility to the state and not to the private sector. Tanzanian business entrepreneurs had always known of their entrepreneurial skills and their ability to do business, but it was one thing to operate a small kiosk operating by the roadside in the parallel economy, or a small gray area firm in the parallel economy. It would be something else altogether to own a large cigarette factory, a large brewery, a large clothing firm, a large shoe firm, a large practice firm. By the mid-1980s, that proto-business elite that had been emerging in these ways through that fatal conjuncture, I think for some period of time, was ready to spread its wings. And at that point, the state economy had become a constraint. Use the word fetter if you like that word. I like that word. The state economy had become a fetter on that group, which was ready, maybe through a process of divestiture of state-owned enterprises, to take over the ownership and management of large-scale industrial enterprises, as well as operating more covertly and on a smaller scale in the informal economy. Andrew mentioned the book by my colleague at UCLA, Sebastian Edwards, on toxic aid, and the argument that it was the aid community which forced, in effect, Tanzania into economic reforms in the mid-1980s. I'm a close friend of Sebastian Edwards. Toward the end of our two books, we had a number of conversations together, but I don't agree with my colleague that it was foreign aid that carries the principal weight of explanation for Tanzania's economic change in approach in the mid-1980s. I think there was a dynamic of socioeconomic change within Tanzania that concerned the economic interests of the larger segment of the Tanzanian governing elite that created a more receptive audience within Tanzania for the kind of reforms that the IMF and the bank had been advocating for some period of time. What have been the effect, pardon me, what have been the effect of reforms on, if I could get a little water, the effect of reforms on the lives of ordinary Tanzanians? For me, Tanzania today presents the great contradiction, the contradiction between economic growth and poverty. Recorded rates of economic growth in Tanzania are quite impressive by any standard, 6-7% a year. Both the World Bank and the Economist Intelligence Unit anticipate that those high rates of economic growth will continue into the future. Those high rates of economic growth translate into impressively high rates of growth in per capita income in Tanzania over the era of economic reforms, which is now approaching its 30th year. Some gentle reminders that I think everybody knows: per capita income changes are not a proxy for poverty alleviation or the remediation of inequality. Indeed, I think they can be quite misleading. Poverty in Tanzania is primarily rural poverty. It's primarily poverty among smallholder farmers who have a mixed economic lifestyle that is partially subsistence, partly market orientation. There's a great opportunity for discussion about the validity and the meaningfulness of economic figures on Tanzania. I'm not well equipped to deal with this, not a quantitative person. I'm a consumer of that data and not a producer of that data. I tend not to be impressed, however, by the mere figures on the growth of per capita income, especially as they affect life in the Tanzanian countryside. There are two particular economic reasons, I think, for doubting those figures. One is the inconsistency between per capita income figures on the one hand and what we learn from household budget surveys. Per capita income figures tell us one story, and household budget surveys in the rural areas tell us a very different story about poverty in the countryside, still 70 to 75% of the Tanzanian population. And there are a variety of compelling reasons to think that the household budget surveys are telling us a more meaningful story about rural poverty than the per capita income figures. One, sheer population increase is reducing the average amount of land availability per person. Secondly, large-scale land concessions, documented by Andrew in his paper. Large-scale land concessions are a social process, socioeconomic process, that transforms smallholder farmers into a labor force on lands that are owned by larger-scale business interests. Adverse environmental conditions are making for a harsher life in the countryside. And sheer urban expansion. We're getting, Dar es Salaam is soon going to reach almost to Morogoro. It's soon going to reach almost to Tanga. Urban expansion is gobbling up land. I noticed it most recently along the Morogoro Road, gobbling up land that had been farmland. So population pressures and environmental changes, we're already seeing some of the symptoms of those. In terms of their impact on rural poverty, so the Piketty viewpoint that economic growth is not the same thing as poverty alleviation or remediation of inequality remains with us. Topics for future discussion, maybe discussion in the next day or two, I would say the China factor and the nature of trade with China, and whether Tanzania is at the early stages of an economic Dutch disease, appreciation of the exchange rate that is having a negative effect on traditional exports and a potential effect in crowding out manufacturing. That would be at the very top of my list. And then for those of us interested in addressing the policy question, I think the readout that I take from the Piketty volume is that we do want to get away from polarizing our economic dialogue as between market forces on the one hand and state involvement in the other. I think serious discussions of development policy have always been and continue to be about how to get the mix right of state and market. And the mix is not going to be the same across countries, and the mix is not going to be the same within a single country over an extended period of time. Again, appreciate the opportunity to be here and look very much forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I suppose my real contribution to this conference could be well to be engaged with Michael and Andrew on this discussion of long-term history. But my paper actually is about something much more contemporary and what its implications are for future policy. I should start by explaining on the geriatric side my own involvement in Tanzania, because that may be relevant not to what I'm going to say now, but to our subsequent discussion. I actually first set foot in Tanzania in October 1963, so I covered the whole 50 years when I visited Bukoba. I was then lecturing at Makerere on leave from Yale. And then subsequently, I became the economic advisor for Eastern Africa to the new British Ministry of Overseas Development. And one of my first tasks there was, following Barbara Castle's visit to Tanzania, to organize a mission to advise the Tanzanian government on implementing the first 5-year plan. And that was the first systematic review of the plan and came up with some of the conclusions that Michael mentioned. I next appeared on the Tanzanian scene in '67 when I was a neighbor of Anthony Elman in the house nearest the State House. I don't know whether that was symbolically important, where I was responsible for editing the second 5-year plan. There's then a long gap of big involvement in Tanzania, but I reappeared in '81 when I led a technical team that supported Ernst Michelet's 3 wise men, including Jerry Helena, that tried to bridge the gap between the Tanzanian government and the donor community, particularly the World Bank and the IMF, strongly supported by the Scandinavians, and tried to come up with a compromise structural adjustment program, which failed. And then my next involvement actually was in the period after the beginning of liberalization, where for 4 years I was professor in Dar. When I got involved in a very quiet way, I actually wrote the final version of the Presidential Commission on Banking Reform. And I also participated with Edwin Matei in the Presidential Commission on taxation and expenditure. So the result was, throughout that whole range of years, I was very actively involved as an actor more than an academic. I mean, I was involved in policy making, debating with government and so forth. And perhaps inevitably, therefore, I end up with a somewhat different view of the way things happened and emerged, which I will have to come back to in the later discussion. Because in a way, it would be more efficient if I had been appointed a discussant to this session and giving my own piece. My own piece is very long and rambling when you get to see it, summarized very clearly in 1 page by David, who did a synopsis, which says, in fact, everything I say in this rather long rambling piece. But I'll tell you a little bit about its origins and why I felt the need to write it. Its origins were as follows. There's a Dutch economist, Henk Mutzeer, who had the idea that there should be a veteran group of people who worked a long time in Africa to comment on African development. And it resulted in the book, What Went Wrong with African Agriculture. And in that book, my piece actually is a variance with almost everyone else's comment. Because when he asked me to do that, interestingly enough, I'd not been very active in Tanzania for some time. In the last 25 years, I've been much more involved in Vietnam than I have in Tanzania, from about 90 on. A very strong involvement in Hanoi. So I came back to look at the Tanzanian data. And the first thing one notices, of course, is there's a conventional wisdom, which is expressed, in fact, very clearly in recent World Bank report on the Tanzanian economy, that by and large, Tanzanian agriculture has been a record of substantial failure, and that there's very little to be seen in terms of income improvement, which in a way Michael was agreeing with, in the rural areas. Now, when I began to look at the data, and this belief that agriculture failed has led to a number of consequences, including the approach which Andrew was criticizing of this sort of large-scale agricultural push because of the perception of the Tanzanian elite that somehow not only our smallholder agriculture failed, but there was not much you could do about it. Now, when you begin to look at the data, it gets more interesting and more complex than that conventional wisdom suggests. It is true that there has been enormous failure of agricultural policies and projects in Tanzania. If you were to look just at the portfolio of World Bank projects, you would have to say that this was a simple story of agricultural disaster. One of the things I did in the period where I wasn't that active in Tanzania is I did act for the Operational Evaluation Department of the World Bank in doing a review of 6 big agricultural projects in Tanzania, all of which were failures. In fact, when I evaluated the Gator Cotton project, the only thing evidence I could find they'd ever been there in Gator was that in the ex-headquarters there was a monopoly set. And I thought, well, maybe teaching people how to pay monopoly would have its development consequences. But otherwise, no sign of any positive effect whatsoever. 6 projects which were all disasters, the one result of which was to get Tanzania more into debt. And then you look again at the various failures of the government's initiatives, is very quickly you come to the view that this is a record of failure. But then if you look at what actually has happened, it turns out the government has failed its interventions, the donors have probably done even worse, but nevertheless, there's been a process of very considerable change in Tanzanian agriculture and a fundamental change in the structure of the economy with very important implications for the future. Now, if you look at the vocabulary, which is still amazingly used, the government documents still talk about cash crops and food crops. And the emphasis on decline is always relates to the rather poor performance of cash crops, all right, export crops. And you look, and that's true, the performance has been not universally bad. I mean, tea's kept up more or less all right. Coffee's been stagnant, but there hasn't declined. Sisal collapsed, partly probably with my own involvement. Anthony will remember the weekend which I was instructed to nationalize the Sisal industry with 3 other people. And that certainly didn't help. But Peter is a knowledge expert in the history of Sisal. He might have his own views of the cause of the decline. But nevertheless, so there were areas of total decline and other areas where, interestingly enough, you have a picture emerging which is very important for the analysis of future agricultural alternatives. In relation to annual crops, particularly cotton, the issue which emerged was of competition with food crop production. All right? I, in 1981, initiated my approach to field research in Africa, which could be called the hitchhiker's approach, which was namely, I discovered if I drove across Tanzania trying to get a very quick view of what was really happening, if I gave anyone who wanted a lift in the car, I had a captive audience and I could really interview them in depth. I remember driving through the cotton zone, actually asking a farmer who we were giving a lift, what would actually increase the production of cotton? And he thought for a while, and he said, well, the price of rice went down. In other words, he had a total intuitive understanding of cost elasticity. So the point about that example is that throughout the decade of confusion in the economy, where macroeconomic factors and the mess up in the marketing have resulted in the decline of so-called cash crop products, food crop production has in fact increased remarkably. And I make a few points here. As Michael mentioned, the rate of urbanization in Tanzania has been quite phenomenal. Dar es Salaam may have 4 million, might have 5 million population now. Cities which, when I first visited them, had about 15,000 like in Mbeya, and now also around about 1 million or more. Mwanza's now a huge city, and so on. So there's now an urban population of Tanzania of about 10 million. Now, a remarkable thing about the mass of the urban population is that predominantly they are fed from domestic agricultural products. 1. 2, if I could remind Anthony when we were neighbors, if you went shopping in Dar in those days, if you wanted to buy in the local market, there was a great scarcity of things which one might naturally wish to have. The variety of vegetables was very few. There was so little fruit production that a particularly crazy Israeli I have working on my staff proposed that we import oranges from Israel. And it wasn't so crazy, but there were very few oranges in Dar. Now, as I've gone over all these years, continuing to live on and off in Dar and shopping my local market, I see extraordinary diversity, and almost every time I go, I see something new popping up. So it's not only that in terms of the major food crops, the countryside is able to feed the city, but there's been an extraordinary response in terms of the innovation in producing new forms of product for the domestic market. The result of this has been that despite the fact that anyone who bothers to look at the household data would discover that for more than 20 years, the income of farmers from selling food crops has exceeded that for cash crops. So that traditional vocabulary is totally ridiculous, although it's still generally in use as of today. But that change has meant that increasingly the link in the development model between the rural and urban areas comes through the market for food crops. It's become quite important. And if you look at the household budget surveys on urban households, it's interesting that because the average income is still very low, that in the household budgets of urban dwellers of Tanzania, about half of what they consume is actually food. So it's not surprising that this link becomes quite important. And as the numbers in the urban areas go on increasing, it will become more important. So this was the first perception. The second perception is this, that in the rural areas, that even if average output does not grow very fast, average cash income from farming goes much faster. Because what previously was a subsistence crop is now sold in some sense, if you were dealing in a Lewis-type model, the people leave to go to the city, they then have to be fed, and they're fed by the food that they might have been involved in growing when they're in the countryside. So you have this important growth of cash income from fruit crops. And the result is that in the countryside, there is more change going on than maybe the gross figures would suggest. In my view, there is actually now a real social revolution going on in the Tanzanian countryside. I give you a few simple examples. The ubiquitous spread of mobile phones has made quite extraordinary difference to the actual situation of rural people in terms of access to information, access to relatives in the city, in general access to the world. I mean, it's now normal to find people, even in poor parts of the country, having access to mobile phones. And this has happened very recently. It's a very fast growth. Secondly, some innovations in transport have also begun to have a dynamic effect. The spread of the boda, for those of you who are not in contemporary Tanzania, boda derives from the Ugandan term boda, which derives in term from border, because these people originally emerged as motorcyclists who engaged typically in smuggling between the Kenyan and Ugandan border, has now again spread to the point where it changes so fast, it's very difficult to know how many. But you go to very remote places in Tanzania, and now people have access through motorbikes, through very poor roads, to district centres. So what I observe is the beginning of very key changes, and even some evidence of changes which are still very limited in their impact, but might over the coming decade begin to appear as very important rural phenomena. like the spread of solar energy. Now in many villages you will find a school teacher or a prosperous farmer will have some solar energy. In the future I think that will spread quite fast. So, and then if you look at the data on food crops, you find some fairly astonishing things. One astonishing thing is when I went to East Africa, rice was a very minor item. You know, I think Tanzania was certainly well less than 100,000 tons back in the 60s. Now Tanzania is producing about 1 million tons of paddy. And so it's become actually a significant producer of rice I can think of a few other things. While some of the traditional food crops probably, unfortunately, have tended to stagnate. I'm talking about millets and things like that. So that you've had, in fact, something very dynamic going on. Now, much of this seems to have happened without any help at all from public facilities. The extraordinary growth of citrus, for example, seems to have happened without any intervention from government. I read the master's thesis of a bright young man from the Sokoine University, where he actually went to the two main areas where citrus has grown and recorded its expansion with, again, as I said, with very little support or intervention from any government services. His conclusion at the end, unfortunately, was that, however, the market seems to be chaotic, maybe the government should set up a marketing board. Yeah, to which I cringe with having. So the question is, what flows from this? What flows from this, I think, is two things. One is that those of us working on Tanzania have to recognize the potential and the actual successes of small agriculture. Two, the next question is what is to be done about this? And there we have a dilemma. And I've been talking to Andrew about the frustrations of the agriculture elite with doing anything in the smallholder sector. And it's not really because the smallholder sector is not performing, it's because they don't really have any instruments to come to terms with the smallholder sector. In the periods of crisis and in structural adjustment, many agricultural institutions went into severe decline, particularly the agricultural research system. And the Agricultural Extension Service, which was not ever anything very much, went into almost disappearance. It's now being restarted. But it means that you do not have the sort of mechanisms at hand for the government, which I saw in Vietnam, and we're very familiar with in Vietnam, to do anything. The second problem is this, and that is a certain degree of total unreality when government starts throwing numbers around about growth. The sort of notion that 4% agricultural growth is a very poor performance, which you can see in the document, is actual nonsense. 4% consistent growth in total agricultural output for a country is very high indeed. And the sort of numbers which Andrew told me have been thrown around as possible targets of 10% growth per year is actually totally absurd. So what the elite have to recognize, in fact, the agriculture has been expanding. As a result of that expansion, there is a potential of income increase and poverty reduction, and that potential may particularly lie in terms of the countryside feeding the city, and that therefore the worst thing imaginable from the point of poverty reduction would be the development of large-scale food production by international companies which would displace the local producers. Now, this is the government's intention. Luckily, they will probably entirely fail. I mean, one of the positive things about Tanzania is most of the more loony ideas flow for a bit, get financed, but don't actually affect anything very much. All right? So this is what I'm saying there. Do I have any more time, David?
You've got about 5 minutes.
All right, well, I will now shift. Having said that, that's what I say. But I'm now shift a bit to respond a bit to one of the points that Michael said. We all have our weaknesses. Economists have weaknesses that may be too dependent on numbers, and in Africa the numbers are often meaningless. Political science have the weakness that they want to see a logic and a systematic set of relationships. And strangely enough, Michael writing about political economy, certainly not from a left-wing point of view, wants to see everything in terms of sort of quasi-class analysis, all right? Now, I have a feeling in Tanzania, it's not an area I work on, that this tries to impose on historical reality a logic and a systemic sort of consequences which is just not there. Now I make one or 2 points about this. One is, I think that one of the differences in Tanzania, if you come from a different tradition of historical interpretation, the great man theory, is there's no question, an awful lot of issues in that period that Michael's discussing flowed from the role and the ideas and the actions of one man, Mwalimu Nyerere, who was president. And one of the questions really is how far he represented in interest. He didn't, he represented himself. He was a unique figure. His great achievements were unique and his mistakes and disastrous mistakes were unique. And I think it's very, very difficult. In a certain sense, my own interpretation was it was precisely the absence of articulated interests in the 60s and maybe even the 70s which allowed Nyerere such freedom of maneuver to do what he wished to do. Now, and so this attempt to read into it, maybe even flowing from Shivji, this sort of class analysis, I find a bit suspect. And here I'll be a bit anecdotal and go back to my remarks about Anthony, my neighbor. In September 1967, and I tell this anecdote for those of you who follow Tanzania, I think this is not without interest. I went back to where I was then staying, which was the Kilimanjaro Hotel, which has already appeared in the discussion, and received a phone call one Friday evening from a man called Ernest Mulakosi. Now, Ernest, by total accident, was a not very senior economist who happened that day technically to be head of the ministry, because all the layers above were at conferences or on leave or whatever. So Ernest was sitting in his office in the planning ministry and received a telephone call from Rashidi Kawawa. All right? Now, those of you who know Kawawa know that period, know he was vice president, prime minister, and Kawawa said, where is the act to nationalize the sisal industry? And poor Ernest said, what act? I don't know anything about this. He said, you go and look at your papers. So he opened the safe, and indeed there were instructions that an act would be produced to nationalize the sisal industry. And he said, oh, sorry, I don't know. And so Kawawa said, what is your name? He said, Ernest Mulakosi. And he said, all right, I've got your name. That act in draft will be on my table in Mwanza, where the Bunge was meeting, by Monday evening or else. All right? So he called me. I had never seen a sisal plantation. Rob Wood, who'd also never seen a sisal plantation, Ernest Mulakosi, and a New Zealand parliamentary draftsman who knew how to write laws, sat down. In 2 days we wrote an act saying which plantations were going to be nationalized. We nationalized one Greek couple by mistake. They had to be denationalized later. And setting up the framework for the Sisal Corporation. We sent that up by Monday evening. Tuesday, it was passed and became law in 24 hours. On Friday, with John Lofchie and Ruben Nabui, I drove up to Tanga to literally take over the industry. Now, the problem with this is very difficult to see what interest will play, except in one respect. And this is, I think, an important thing of interpretation, which I like Michael to think about. That is, in that period, the popularity and success of those measures was at least in part based on the fact that for most African Tanzanians, large firms, capitalists in general, were, in fact, non-Africans. If you've done one of those psychiatric tests that people do with stick figures, you know, with black, brown, and white, and asked anyone in Tanzania which ones were the capitalists, it would have been the brown and the white, not the black. So in many ways, the other aspect, I think, of that period was the driving force of many of the initiatives for taking over institutions, while in rhetoric was socialist, in practice, I think, was often nationalist and based upon instincts and feelings about the various communities. I finish up by saying this, and that is a lecture I gave in 1972 in Oxford to the African Student Society in the middle of the famous strike of, and so there was no electricity. It's not only in Dar that happens, but in Oxford no electricity. So I gave this lecture to a packed room with candles lighting. So I was a bit like a priest addressing. and a young Nigerian asked the sort of question which in those days was rather typical of the questions you would get in European universities. Would they succeed in building socialism in Tanzania? And I stopped for a moment and I said the following. I said, look, there's an interesting debate amongst socialists about whether you can build socialism in one country. We're all familiar with that debate, and there are arguments on both sides. But I find it difficult to believe you will build socialism in one country with one socialist. And that was, in fact, the issue, that so much of this was emanating from Tanzania, and it was not entirely obvious. I mean, people went along with it, maybe because it was in their interest, maybe that's where you have a point, but it was not actually articulated as a clear view of any group. And I will finish by saying another little bit about anecdote. When we took the plan to the cabinet in 1968, this is the second five-year plan, under instructions from Nkemba and State House, we had been told that the government, having nationalized so much and done so much, in this coming period they were mainly interested in making that work. They were not interested in major initiatives. We went to the cabinet with the plan. The agricultural sector plan was more or less very conventional. It was very much, these sort of export crop project exercises, which were typical of the period. Nyeri, having read it very carefully, said to me and Claire Bamsuya, who were presenting the stuff, he said, this is very good, very well written, but shouldn't we in this plan period go for Ujamaa? So instead of having a debate, the ministers around the table started banging the table, Ujamaa, Ujamaa. So he turned to me and said, you've got to go back and redo that. And someone mentioned that Ujamaa was spread subsequently through the document. So I then thought, well, as I know nothing about the subject, I would go and talk to various people who might be knowledgeable. Andrew, who was my neighbor and been running a settlement scheme, was knowledgeable, he was helpful. There was a man called Malinga who has founded the Rovuma Development Association, which later closed down by TANU because they thought it was too successful, was working for the party, and he was knowledgeable. Lionel Cliff, sadly, the late Lionel Cliff, he just died, had thought a lot about this because he was teaching in Kivukoni and had a very shrewd eye of the dangers and weaknesses because he knew a lot about the party cadres, and probably Griff Cunningham, who ran. Very few people in the university actually began to think about those issues. And no one else in the government I could talk to, even the ministers who had been banging the table, had a clue what Malimu wanted to do. I mean, they obviously had a clue about the rhetoric that had been set out in various documents. Nyeri was nothing if not a fluent writer and fluent speaker. So everyone knew in a broad sense the rhetoric, but what it would mean in practice was very unclear. The result and the effect was that by the early 70s, when the rather cautious approach initially adopted was not having the results and they decided to do mass mobilization, the thing translated into something which was very, very different than Nyeri's rhetoric. And then maybe, again, what was the interest of the bureaucratic class? All right? He's telling me to stop, and he's probably right, because I could now go on with so many others. But the interest of the civil servants, it wasn't an evil thing, but just to make it a bit easier for them to do their jobs. So irrespective of what villagization would do to agriculture, they thought it a damn good idea to put everyone together in a place they could get to easily. And the consequences are well known. Anyway, I'll finish off here. Now we can have a discussion about these various things, but I would go back not to this geriatric review of one's early life, but to what I'm saying about the current agricultural situation, is that one has now very much to address in Tanzania how to help or at least how not to be unhelpful to the mass of food-producing farmers, smallholder farmers in Tanzania. Good.
Where for the most part in Kenya the Asian community was given its head, you can see the huge contribution to Kenyan development from that community. And I don't think we've ever quite recovered actually from the way in which that community was knocked on the head. And the third one, I think we should really also talk more recently, not so much in the 70s and 80s, about illicit capital flight. I'm not addressing this only from an anti-corruption point of view, but the figures which people like Global Financial Integrity put together now on the extent to which through mispricing of products traded by both multinationals and local companies of illicit flight from Tanzania are extremely serious. And I think unless one captures that, then one misses a lot about what is going on in terms of the way in which people are manipulating the resource flow and export values.
Thank you. I'm Anthony Elm, another of Brian's geriatrics. It's hard to follow the three giants, very brilliant analyses, but I'd just like to make one or two comments. Andrew said that we have gone full circle from the transformation approach to agriculture of the early 60s to the large-scale land leases to foreign companies of the current period. I think there is a big difference between the two in that the transformation approach of the 60s, in theory, was, no, in practice, was involving small farmers, including incorporating them in large-scale agriculture, whereas currently, if not the aim, the effect is certainly being to exclude them, grabbing land, grabbing water, and creating a lot of alienation. It needn't be like that, and perhaps this afternoon we'll hear more of how, with the outgrower scheme, contract farming discussion, how small farmers could benefit from some of these large-scale schemes. But it's yet to be seen in practice. Andrew referred also to Arkadie, the village settlement scheme of which I was the first manager from 1963 till 66. And it was one of, at least for the first 10 years, a successful example, relatively successful, of small farmers moving to large-scale agriculture. The reason, a major reason, there were several, but the reasons why it succeeded was partly that there were farmers who were desperate to get the opportunity of this very fertile land which was offered to them, but mainly that the cash crop on which it was based was a food crop, was wheat, sheep, cattle, and irrigated vegetables. And so it was feeding into the local economy rather than export crops like cotton and cashew and coffee, few of the benefits of which went to the growers. I revisited this farm last year, Arkadie, marking the 50th anniversary of the founding of the cooperative, and there have been interesting developments. The prime one was that the population had grown from 500 to over 5,000. And I think that we haven't perhaps had enough discussion on the impact of population explosion, which is making it very, very difficult to find a form of land use which is going to create employment and incomes for the expanded population. When I talked with farmers about what the future holds for their children and grandchildren, they said, Tanzania ni pana. Tanzania is a big country. People can move elsewhere. But it just isn't the case that good land elsewhere is as fully occupied as it is around Kitete. But there have been some positive developments there, that farmers have gone from extensive cultivation of not very high value crops to intensive cultivation of higher value, producing vegetables for sale to the tourist hotels in the vicinity. And also that when I talked with farmers about what would have happened if that scheme had not been there, what they all said was that the few large capitalist farmers in the area would have grabbed all the land and they would have been a lot worse off than they are now.
Okay, can we keep it reasonably short, please? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Dan Brockington. I'm from the University of Manchester, and it's been a privilege to listen to a panel of this experience and composition, so thank you very much indeed. I'd like to draw our attention to an interesting contradiction which came across from the speakers. Andrew said that there have been impressive growth figures but very little impact on levels of poverty, and that rapid GDP growth will not lessen poverty in rural areas. And Michael agreed with him, saying that poverty is primarily rural among the smallholder farmers. And Brian said that there's a social revolution taking place in rural areas in Tanzania, driven by sales of food crops. The survey work and data I'll be presenting tomorrow suggest, I think, that Brian is right, and that there are problems in inferring high levels of poverty from household budget surveys. I'll go into the details of that at the presentation tomorrow. But I'm not quite sure why you would be right, Brian. This is because that most rural farmers are net buyers of food, and the rise in maize prices that appears to have taken place in the last 15 years or so would be a cost to most households. And I wondered if the panel would like to reflect on the village level dynamics with respect to land ownership and labour patterns that might be emerging if there is indeed the social revolution that Brian indicated.
Right, that's three questions covering, or questions and comments covering really quite a lot. Can we have some kind of responses? Maybe start with Andrew and work to the left.
I better have a microphone.
Yeah, we need. Oh,
You should say to the right.
Does
does that work?
How does it work? I don't know what. Sorry. Is that?
Oh, that's for the camera. Okay.
Oh, it's for the camera. Is it?
Have we got a
I
microphone
haven't
somewhere?
Got a microphone. I need a hand one or something.
Yeah, we've got one there. Okay.
I'll just comment on some of the. Yes, I'll just comment on some of the things that have been said. First of all, when I talked about the transformation approach, perhaps I envisaged it in something bigger than purely the transformation approach as it was interpreted in the 60s in the settlement schemes. Maybe what's actually happening is closer to what was attempted with the groundnut scheme, taking over a huge area of land and trying to farm it with mechanised and very large-scale agriculture. Or you could put it in the context which it is being discussed of land grabbing and a whole debate about the role of agribusiness, not just in Tanzania, but in other African countries and indeed in Latin America and other Asian countries. And that whole sort of issue of the ownership of land, the use of it and so on. And there's some quite worrying things which I didn't have time to go through in my paper. The Tanzania Investment Bureau deals with the allocation of land to incoming overseas investors. And can you imagine that any dispute on that is now can be settled in international courts? It's been taken out of the Tanzanian courts. So if you give a multinational company 20,000 hectares and they don't farm it or they don't follow their contract, any dispute resulting won't even be decided in Tanzania. So I mean, it's that type of thing that I'm really concerned about, more than a debate about settlement and outgrowers and so on. We're going to have an interesting discussion on outgrowers this afternoon. As far as corruption is concerned, and this is what I'd be also interested in what Michael has to say about this. The person who influences me most is Mushtaq Khan. Perhaps I should say first, Lawrence Cockcroft has written a book on corruption, and I would commend anybody who's interested in this to look at it, which avoids and certainly that book doesn't, my comment on the book would be it doesn't discuss the debates about whether corruption sometimes has beneficial circumstances. Now, clearly, it's dysfunctional in the sense that as it becomes public, it creates disbelief and annoyance and anger. The sort of effect that opposition parties like Chadema are exploiting quite successfully at the moment. But it's also the case that China's been very corrupt and grown very rapidly indeed, as we know. Malaysia's corrupt, Korea is corrupt. Britain is corrupt in many regards. There are high levels of corruption and they haven't stopped growth. How is that? Well, there's some arguments about it in Michael's book as to why that might be. He says one of the reasons it might work is that corruption might actually break through stupid regulations. And people just get on with things and do the right thing, and by paying off somebody not to follow the stupid regulations. But I think there's a more profound argument, which is it allows the accumulation of capital, and that may then be used properly, and that similar arguments actually to the ones that go back to Schumpeter and Sergeant Florence and some grand old names from the past who argued the benefits of monopoly. What corruption gives you is a temporary monopoly, and you can use, so all those arguments that monopoly can sometimes be beneficial would apply to corruption. I think, just two other quick points. I absolutely agree with Lawrence about the Asian community, and I think they're the elephant in the room. I think it's really, in fact, contributing a lot to Tanzania's exports at the moment, more than cash crops, and mostly from what remains of that community. And it's striking that they're missed out of big results now, therefore. And as far as transfer pricing and capital flight and so on, he's absolutely right. So I'm not against transparency. I'm certainly not in favour of corruption, just arguing that it can have some benefit. It can actually be helpful in certain circumstances.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll also be brief. First, again, I second Andrew's accolade to Lawrence Cockcroft's, I think, terribly important book on corruption. I think if we had the inclination to do so, we could spend the 2 days of the conference discussing that phenomenon alone. An economic phenomenon of the importance of rent-seeking or corruption in Tanzania has pluses and minuses. I don't think it lends itself to a single evaluation. My view, as I mentioned, was that it did facilitate a certain amount of capital accumulation among Africans in Tanzania. It was not confined to any group, but it facilitated capital accumulation. And by the mid-1980s, capital accumulation to a degree that created an economic class with an interest in economic liberalization so as to take over large-scale assets. I know that my friend, a lifelong teacher, one begins one's career as a student of Brian Van Arkadie and one ends one's career as a student of Brian Van Arkadie. But I think there was a powerful group economic interest by the mid-1980s in economic liberalization because it would permit this group, which had acquired wealth in that way and invested it in the informal sector, to have a very strong stake in economic liberalization, which I think arguably did improve things. On the household budget survey issue, I really look forward to this paper. One of the most difficult data categories in Tanzania to parse, and I think it's terribly important that we're going to get help on this, is the quantity, the value of household income, and how one calculates it depends very greatly on how one estimates the subsistence, the economic value of the subsistence portion of household consumption. And so, if you're doing a household income survey during a period of the year when the value of, when the maize price is low or the rice price is low, then the economic value of household income is going to be low because you're consuming a certain amount of low value commodity. If you're doing that household survey during a season of the year when the maize price has gone up, it's going to make it look as if household income is a bit higher. On the final question that I think Brian raises, and that is Tanzania as a wealthy country. I would completely agree. Tanzania is inevitably, in the next few years, going to become a very wealthy country. If one looks at natural resource exports, natural gas, mineral ores, precious metals, timber, there's no question that there is going to be a substantially increased flow of wealth to Tanzania. And that's going to make income levels look very high. The critical challenge facing Tanzania is not to increase the flow of wealth, it's what it does about the distribution of that wealth. And I think along with inequality, there's another, if I could take one more minute, a comparison we want to make with the Nyerere era. I think we've established that the Nyerere era economic policies were a dismal problem, and maybe even the political outcome of those policies. In one respect, I think, we have to praise the socioeconomic success of Nyerere's policies, which is they help to promote socioeconomic mobility into a Tanzanian middle class by universalizing access to education, including university education. A number of Tanzanians who grew out of poor families had the legitimate aspiration that they could rise to become university professors, professional people, and so on. For me, the most troublesome aspect of the oligarchic tendency in Tanzania today is that potential for economic mobility out of poverty and into well-being gets shrunk by the kind of maldistribution of the growing wealth that's taking place.
I address a few of the points. In relation to things Lawrence said, the first thing is an interesting thing, I think, and I haven't read Mike's book yet to see how he handled it, is when you look at the history of the government interventions in the economy, strangely enough, the immediate Arusha things did not somehow undermine the self-confidence of the Asian community. Strangely enough, even in some sense, their position improved in the sense that they basically ran the banking system immediately after nationalization. And it was later, Lawrence says 71, that's probably right, that the government began to push into things that really alarmed the Asian community, which had given signals that they were willing to shift their interests and concern into the industrialization effort. And particularly, what I don't know about, because I wasn't there, was the absurd act of nationalizing urban property. This was a thing which I have the impression was the most damaging thing from the point of the Asian community. Many middle-class Asian families, about the only real wealth they had was in their housing, and it was totally meaningless in terms of any outcome. Because after the nationalization, all the people stayed in the same place they were. The only obvious effect was the deterioration in the maintenance of the property. So it had no positive effect, and couldn't actually therefore be seen simply as a rather malicious intervention and attack on the Asian community. But I don't know what was going on at that time, so that's an interesting. On corruption, there is a moral question here. When I went back to Tanzania in '81, I was told two things, and they are related. One, I was told the motto of the civil service now is the government pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. Now, the fact of the matter is, and the corruption really built up in the mid-70s. Now, if someone is a family man, has to look after family, and the only way he can feed his family is by actually accepting child, becoming corrupt. Morally, that is not an obviously bad thing. You can't say that someone trying to feed their family is doing something which is immoral. The problem with corruption, obviously, is when it becomes pervasive and you move from what sometimes people say the history of corruption is the move from need to greed. The ones who learned how to do it, you're no longer doing it to feed the family or doing it to grab things. Huh? And so I think that is an interesting. But secondly, the other thing I was told when I came back is that in Tanzania now the issue is not technical know-how, it's technical know-who. I later had a problem when I used it in an article, and the proofreaders kept on changing how to who back down. But the point was, in that period of scarcity, even more important than giving a bribe was often one's pattern of connection. You know, so I was always very intrigued in my web of my shemages, my in-laws, my wife being Tanzanian. So if you wanted to get a seat on the plane, which you could only get by influence, you'd have to find whether you had a second cousin who was actually working for Tanzanian Airways. And indeed, the very man who told me about the importance of technical know-how was the head of the Sugar Corporation. And one day I went to see him about something else, and very shamefacedly I said to him, you know, Reuben, my wife keeps on telling me that I know everyone and we don't have anything at home and she wants sugar. And I said, do you know how I can get some sugar? And he said, Brian, I didn't realize you never asked. And he opened the door to a sub-room in his suite, and there, piled to the ceiling, were 5 kilo packs of sugar, one of which he immediately gave me. No financial transaction at all. So part of that transition period of parallel economy and so on was how on this extreme scarcity, a whole different nexus of transactions emerged. And when I worked in the Soviet Union in its final days, I saw the same phenomenon, that you had often a barter economy emerging, where one favor was exchanged for another. Later, I think, in Tanzania, it became something different. And if I'm going on too long, stop me, but there's a lovely story, which is not very complimentary to Africans, but I was told by an African, and I've heard repeated by Africans, of a conference in Nigeria in the 60s of ministers of transport, and the minister of transport of Congo going there and be amazed at the size of the minister's house. And he said, well, how do you pay for it? So he took him to the window, pointed to a 4-lane highway and said, 10%. Some years later, the Nigerian went to the Congo to see the same guy, and by then that guy was living in a palace. So the Nigerian said, well, how do you pay for this? So the Congolese guy took him to the window and pointed to a grass track with a guy walking a goat along it. So the Nigerian looked puzzled. So the Congolese said, 100%. In other words, there are different sort of corruption systems, and it is noticeable in the Asian countries. They do seem to work. The final point I would make, which is not what, I think I'll leave the discussion of the interesting point you raised till later, except to make one point. I'm intrigued by it, but don't fully understand what it means if output is not even growing, but if sales to the urban areas are growing, and so you have a big monetization of agriculture. The implication of that, I haven't followed that through. But I'd like to inject another issue into the discussion, which really relates to what we've been saying. We've all assumed that nationalisation was not only a failure, but was inevitably a failure, all right? But the two most successful capitalist countries in the world in the last decade have been China and Vietnam, who basically built their initial growth on state enterprise and have still resisted generalised privatisation. So the question has to be posed, why was nationalisation such an incredible failure in Tanzania? Because I think that is of interest, because we have to look, you know, in an open mind actually at the future options. Thank you.
Okay.
Michael McGowan, I was interested in Africa, particularly Tanzania. I think it was Michael who began his address by suggesting that a lot of the academic interest in Tanzania had been almost punching above its weight, and it's certainly the case that there's been a lot of academic and political interest in Tanzania over the years. And I'm conscious of the fact that Bradford University, which from its charter to begin with talked about the application of knowledge to human welfare. Now, it appears that also in Tanzania itself, that the academic world attracted people from all over, was a bit of a hot spot. And I just wonder if this scenario of the stupidity of Tanzania and the sort of lack of understanding of the world by Nyerere and everything that's happened since, to what extent the academic world, including the economists, were a resource for the successes or failure, to what extent Nyerere, the government, and everyone since has taken any notice of all this, you know, incredible industry of academic research. And I really come to the question, you know, what do we now learn from this scenario of Tanzania? And I'd be very interested in your comments on this.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Kozilo from Tanzania, Mzumbe University. my hat off for the 3 very exciting presentations. 2 quick comments on Andrew's paper with regards to the big results now. And I think, as you said, I think it was a surprise to even some of us when it came. But I think it's important to note the timing of this, that this has come at the time when the country was already starting to articulate the implementation and operationalization of the so-called performance management system, a system that was installed for 6 years, for example, in the first phase of the public service reform program. And the ethos for the PMS is more or less exactly the same as the BRIN. What has happened here is that only a few sectors have been identified, and therefore one wonders to what extent, therefore, BRIN complement PMS. But the second comment is on the selection of the sectors, which takes us back when we started with our the poverty reduction strategy then in the mid-90s to early 2000, that also we selected a few sectors, and other sectors felt isolated, and then we had to change in the second phase to the national strategy for growth and reduction of poverty, 1 and 2, where only clusters were identified, and therefore sectors and other agencies were to see how they fitted in this strategy. So I'm just saying whether this also may have the same impact, where you felt, well, how do I fit in? You know, in education is really concentrating on primary and secondary education. So the higher education sort of wonders, how do we fit in on this, and so on and so forth. So this was just my quick comments on that one. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps if we get unless there's anybody else, perhaps we get the panel to briefly answer that. We've got about 5 minutes, and then we should have some lunch.
Let's start this then. I just very quickly say the influence of the university people. I would say at the time when these critical things were going on, the university was tended to be involved in more of an ideological and philosophical debate, and not on very practical issues related to decisions the government was actually making. As a matter of fact, at the time of the second 5-year plan, the group who were most influential were the regional planners, who basically produced the government's regional plan from what was run the Bureau of Resource Assessment, Land Use Planning. I don't think that by and large, well, they recruited some people. John Lofchie maybe was the most important, who was very critical in development of the banking system. But by and large, I would say during that critical period, in a practical sense, the university intellectuals really didn't have a great deal of influence on what happened. And indeed, the fact that the atmosphere at one point in the university was, you know, being more Catholic than the Pope, that they had really become really radical and were pushing hard, and could be seen even as critics from the left. That was certainly true in the case of someone like John Saul, of Tanu and of Nyeri, that in some ways the politicians saw them as a threat rather than a threat.
Yeah.
On the question of capital flows, both in and out of Tanzania and within Tanzania, this is a topic that I would deeply welcome additional research on. Just a couple of quick observations. I think capital in Tanzania has flowed every which way and in all directions. When I think of the major directions of capital inflow in the early 1980s, you had something called the anti-economic saboteurs campaign. And what it meant was that under conditions of economic scarcity, anybody who was involved in retail enterprise who was considered to have a large stock of goods, food goods or other goods, was considered a potential economic saboteur. You could be arrested, you could be put in prison. Much of the brunt of the economic saboteur campaign fell on Asians, but much of it also fell on Tanzanians as well. So the economic saboteurs campaign became a huge, it made doing business in the official economy, or what remained of the official economy, a very risky proposition, and a number of people who were still engaged in legitimate retail trade in Tanzania shifted their economic resources out of the formal sector and into the informal sector, which was, of course, immune from the anti-economic saboteurs campaign. The economic saboteurs campaign came to a quick end, but not, I think, before it did considerable additional damage by causing that particular economic inflow. Second observation I make is that capital can go every which way. During the early period of trade reform in the late 1980s, there was a trade liberalization program called own financed imports. And what it meant was that if you had foreign exchange legitimately acquired in overseas accounts, you may have been a student overseas, you may have been a professional overseas, and so on, you could bring your foreign exchange back into the country, or the goods that it would buy, and there was a no questions asked provision in the own financed import scheme. You could bring that capital back in, you could bring it back in the form of goods and customs, no question asked. So it became a huge incentive for additional corruption to get capital out of the country, but only to get capital out of the country to bring goods into the country so that you could sell those goods under conditions of scarcity that still prevailed for very high prices. So you had capital going out and goods coming back in, again, every which way. The other broad observation I would make about capital flows is on economic liberalization more broadly and capital flows, I think by and large, wish we had evidence on this, I think by and large, economic liberalization has provided a broad-gauged incentive for Tanzanians to bring capital back into the country, just as there's been the reversal of intellectual flight. I think there's been a reversal of capital flight. Intellectuals have flowed back, especially professional people, medical doctors, and so on, come back to take advantage of more liberal economic circumstances. And I think many Tanzanians who had begun to sequester capital overseas now find that they can do business safely and profitably in Tanzania. So again, capital flowing every which way.
Can I make a quick point on what?
I think, can we give Andrew a chance? We're running out of time, I think. So.
Right. I think I'd better bow to the chair.
Go on. There's just one point I want to make on what...
Right. Well, quickly then, the people who worked in Tanzania went on to other things and many of them actually had powerful positions in consultancy work and in other academic fields, and so I think there's more influence as individuals than there is, as if you like, as a school, if you like, as a collective. Now, a lot of the left-wing dialogue was actually within left-wing circles, didn't extend much outside. At the moment, though, there is and it's partly due to the coming of Chinese, Vietnamese, and now Malaysian leaders to Tanzania. There is an increased interest in the role of the state, and so many of the things that were actually talked about in the 70s are now almost coming back onto the agenda. What should the actions of the state be in order to protect the essentials of the economy and get it into the right path, as has happened more in Vietnam, let's say, more successfully in Vietnam than in Tanzania. Just comment on one other thing. This whole issue, I hope we can discuss more this whole issue of the peasantry and how they survive and relationships to poverty. The first thing to say is there are many other sources, and we simplified a lot of that in the discussion this morning, but there's a lot of other sources of income. I mean, Debbie Bryson reckons that up to 1 million individuals benefit from artisanal mining directly or indirectly. That's a lot of families. There's a lot of work in crafts and the informal sector, which is combined with agriculture. There's a lot of related things in forestry, fishing, and so on. So you can make a long list of other ways of earning income. Now, there's also complications in the statistics in that a lot of farmers are not able to satisfactorily store crops, or they need urgent needs for money. So they sell crops at one part of the season and buy food at another part. So again, you've got to be very careful with how you value those transactions and how you include them in either household budget surveys or any other form of survey. So I think this whole question of, well, what that raises is are we any longer concerned about differentiation within the small-scale farming community, or do we just talk about small-scale versus large-scale? In the past, there was a lot of discussion of kulaks, an implication that the farmer planting 10 acres was somehow bad compared with a farmer planting 2 or 3 or 4 acres. Now, I would be against that sort of division in Tanzania as much as I would be about the same discussion in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. It's not a helpful way of looking at the problem or the issues. What really matters is whether small farmers can feed themselves and make a surplus, because if they can't, then nothing is going to happen in terms of poverty in Tanzania.
I just wanted to raise a quick historical point with Michael to think about a bit, and that is this, that when you go back to the beginnings of the reform period, the campaign against the Walangusi that you mentioned, which is the black marketeers, and it turned out everyone was a black marketeer. In Bukoba, almost every businessman was put inside, and the own account import scheme, which was the first real beginning, actually, of economic reform, were initiated by the same person, Sokoine. And my interpretation, a little bit, without any real evidence, and I would like to see someone explore that, is that the move to reform, this Sokoine originally went into the Walangusi campaign in the spirit that if those are the regulations, that's what should be applied. When that didn't work, he then was willing to consider what alternative was available and came up with the own account import scheme. And that was interesting because that was a brief period when probably Nyeri had someone as Prime Minister who he allowed real autonomy. It was not just Nyeri's personal point. That was all.
Right, I think we probably reached lunchtime. So I'd like to thank the 3 speakers and also all of the people who've raised points and questions in the floor. I think we've had, hopefully, a very stimulating session and hopefully even more to come in the afternoon. So thank you very much.